Okay. Well, again, thank you, Andrea, for being willing to meet with me. We've had some good conversations, and I'm really excited about this interview. I think we're going to learn some valuable stuff from you and about you.
And vice versa. Thanks,
Yeah,
thanks for having me, and love talking about financial planning in general. So, yeah, for sure, looking forward to it.
that's awesome. One of the things that prompted me to do this in the beginning was to bring attention, especially to independent planners. I think we have to work a little extra hard to get our branding out there because we don't have a large firm or a established name, that's been out there. And that's what I like to do this for. And it's been really cool to see the people that are willing to share about themselves. So we'll dive in to a couple of these questions. So,
Okay.
Andrea, for you, tell me, what's the hardest part of being a financial planner?
So we're getting right into it.
Yes.
The hardest part, that's a really good question because I think that depending on the day, there are different hard parts that I would say challenge me. And over time, it has definitely also changed. I because I've been a financial planner now for so long,
Mhm.
my challenges and my experience as a planner has shaped what is more so difficult, just based on what I have experienced in the past. I would say that the most difficult thing about being a financial planner in the industry is differentiating what I do from a traditional financial advisor. There's a lot of nomenclature mismatch, especially I'm up here in Canada. So we often struggle to differentiate our titles, and our
Mhm.
title regulation up in Canada is not fantastic. Let's just leave it at that for now. Where there is really not a lot of knowledge out there in the public about how to differentiate between the two roles, and where there is crossover and where there isn't crossover. So I would say that my hardest job as a planner is to really explain to the public or to prospects coming to see me what it is that I actually do that differentiates me from what they would think of or maybe confuse with a traditional financial advisor.
Gotcha. Well, tell me, what do you usually say? Any buzzwords that make it simpler?
And you know what? That's actually a really hard question too. That's why it's my hardest thing to explain as a financial planner.
Mhm.
I would say in the traditional sense, a financial advisor, again, up here in Canada, is someone who's more so thought of as managing money. So they are more perhaps on the investment management side of things. They're not always a certified financial planner or have the skills of financial planning. So their focus is more so on, again, investments, risk management, asset allocation, and managing a client's portfolio. Now, that's not always the case. So where there is crossover, it becomes harder for that client to understand the differentiation. What I would tell a client is a financial planner is someone who is able to look at all of the different elements of your financial life. And I will go through the 6 different elements of planning, from, cash flow and debt to risk management to estate, retirement, tax and savings, education, and investment planning as well.
Yeah.
And creating a holistic picture of what all of those elements working together are doing to achieve that client's financial objectives. A good analogy that I like to use is if you're ever working on a puzzle and you've got all these puzzle pieces lying on a desktop, you're trying to create the picture on the front of the box. What does
Mhm.
that picture look like? Because usually a client comes to me and they have a smattering of pieces of the puzzle here, there, and everywhere, and they're sometimes in silo, and they haven't been aggregated together to form a cohesive picture.
Okay.
So I'm trying to create that blueprint for the client to then have a good understanding of their financial situation so that they can make more informed decisions going forward.
Gotcha. I think that's a great way to put it. It's honestly very similar to difficulties that we've had here in the US too.
Mm-hmm.
The title is not protected the same way that an attorney or some type of a doctor is, where that title has a very specific protection and licensure that you need to have to use it. Not quite the same.
Mm-hmm.
And that adds a lot of confusion, I think, for consumers. And for us, we're both in that category of advice only,
Mm-hmm.
which to add to the confusion with another name or
Yeah.
category. But in my view, people grasp what we do a lot simpler than what we say. We get paid generally on an hourly or a fixed rate. We don't earn commissions or our paycheck through products or through ongoing money management. And once you describe it that way, I think it's really easy for people to grasp. And there's a big subset of the community and for just largely for consumers to be able to use us. I think that's awesome. I start you off with a hard question, but this one is a little happier, right? So what is your biggest payoff or satisfaction point when you're working with clients?
I can probably point to an example from this morning.
Okay.
My biggest payoff is when I can feel the client having the confidence to take the engagement and the results of our engagement and take action and have the confidence to make financial decisions because they have the empowerment and the tools in order to do so.
Okay.
I finished a what I call modular or project-based engagement this morning with a client. The focus of the engagement was really that the clients wanted to upsize their home and going from, in Canada, we have very expensive homes, by the way. And going from about a $1.1 million home to a $2.4 million home.
Okay.
And what are some of the considerations given their specific situation that they need to consider? And there are many when they're looking to make that upsize. So we worked together for about 3 months on this project, and we just finished this morning. And I think the payoff for me is unsolicited feedback from the client saying the way in which you have articulated this and laid this out and helped us to understand all of the elements has led us to so much more clarity in making our decisions. And really, I have a lot of confidence going forward to be able to do so. So I think that's for me the payoff. The payoff is the work that I'm doing impactful for the client. That's my whole job, right? Like it's not for me, it's for them. So if I'm not doing my job, then they leave feeling confused and maybe no better off than they were before. Getting unsolicited feedback is so rewarding because that's why we do what we do. We want clients to feel empowered. We want them to feel like they walked away in a much better position than when they walked in, from a empowerment and knowledge standpoint as a foundation for everything.
That's excellent. I had a teacher in the CFP program that would emphasize that a lot. Remember that you're dealing with people with real lives. And we've both seen how frequently someone can operate for decades on faulty information or assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And when they finally get to you, the onus is on you to provide accurate information. But once you do it and they actually feel empowered by it, huge deal. I love that. I think that's awesome. That's super cool. Well, something that I want to talk about that's a little bit more specific to you, Andrea, being someone that's working cross-border situations, working in Canada, and needing to be familiar with quite a bit of regulation, both on your side and on our side of the border. Tell me, what do you feel that you do better than anyone else does?
Better than, that's a really big, I mean, I don't know that I can tell myself of being better than anyone.
There's a lot of hubris in that question, and I asked it that way, so you do have to
I'll work around it
a little bit.
I would say that the field in which I specialize, which we'll say is US Canadian crossover of financial planning, is one that not a lot of practitioners have the knowledge and acumen of in Canada, specifically in the advice-only space. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of cross-border licensed financial advisors up in Canada who can actually manage portfolios that are in the States. So, for example, they're duly licensed in both Canada and the US. They can manage IRAs from Canada. They can manage, clients' non-registered wealth if they leave and move internationally. There's a lot of capabilities in that respect. So there's a huge knowledge base that's being built up in Canada there. I used to work for a team that did that, and taking that away from the specific investment management space and moving more into the financial planning space was interesting because there are so few of us who do this work in Canada. I would venture to say under 10, maybe a few more. So it is a very well, I mean, I can probably name on one hand the number of firms that are either fee for service or advice only that do cross-border. Right. So it is a very niche space. And so if you want to say I do that on, a level that is better than anyone else. I can put myself maybe in the group of those people, but I'm always learning. And it's very difficult, that space, because we have to pay attention to legislation on both sides of the border. The big, beautiful tax bill that is now currently, I think it's in the Senate, if I'm not mistaken, or moving to the Senate. We have to pay attention to all that as much as we do in our own legislation, which is also changing right now because we have a new prime minister.
Right.
So understanding how the rules affect each other and what the implications of something happening in the US are on US citizens living in Canada, or US tax filers living in Canada, or even just domestic Canadians. We have to understand all of that and be able to synthesize that information in a way that is understood by our clients, because it is very, wordy. And in the tax environment, it can be overwhelming for a client to really understand what the heck is going on. So that's a really important element of our job, is really synthesizing a lot of this information and making sure that our clients understand how it affects them specifically.
Right.
So I think, and I could talk about cross-border for hours, but
Sure. Well, I've got some questions about that I'd love to go
sure, go
into.
ahead.
In our last conversation, we talked a little bit about those cross-border situations, and also about what concerns are on the minds of Canadians, on the minds of US folks, or those who have dwelt in both spaces. A good friend of mine is Canadian and his wife is American, and they've lived in both areas. And there's a lot of concerns, especially after the election, and what legislation could change.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear from you in terms of post-election, and with the really big, beautiful bill that's going through Congress right now.
Yeah.
Tell me what concerns that you are hearing from clients, or what advice that you're giving backwards.
So preface this to say that because it's still not passed legislation,
Of
that
course.
we have to approach our advice with a more of a we're watching this lens at this point. I
Right.
can tell you there's so many concerns. One that has been apparent for a while, which has nothing to do with the bill, is how well Social Security is going to hold up, and whether or not it will even be available to residents of Canada who are not US tax filers in the future. There is a bill right now that I'm following, a different bill that implicates foreigners who used to work in the US who have no ongoing US tax filing obligations, possibly not being able to collect on their Social Security benefits in the future because they're not US tax filers. Now, that is a slow-moving bill. I'm watching it, but that is something that is definitely concerning, is will it be available? And if it is available, because we're forecasting that we're going to run out of reserves, or that we're going to slowly run out of being able to fully capitalize the requirements of the pensions for Social Security pensioners, that's concerning. So we're running a lot of our financial modeling assuming that if there's no changes in the interim, we're going to have a reduction to future Social Security benefits by 2034. So that's definitely something that we're following, and that's for both, U.S. tax filers and non-U.S. tax filers. So that affects, people in both brackets. There's always concern and currency management concerns. What is going to be the implication of the ongoing target of the moving U.S. to Canadian dollar on their financial planning longer term, and what kind of decisions do we need to make if we have a really strong year for one of the two currencies, and how do we be more adaptive in our planning based on that? And that can be concerning, because there's never an answer that we're going to be correct on, because hindsight is 2020, right? So that's concerning. From the standpoint of post-Trump, and obviously tariffs and all of the concern about the rhetoric that has been coming out of the White House, I can tell you, I think we talked about this before, Canadians are concerned, especially given the bill that has come out. There are a lot of negative ramifications for non-US tax filers in that bill. All goes part and parcel from the narrative that we're getting from the White House around fairness and tax fairness. But it really truly can implicate many countries, not just Canada or not just Canadians, who are affected by this possible change of legislation. So I'll give you an example. In countries that the bill views as not paying their fair share or is treating the US unfairly, an example is the digital services tax provision that has been that many countries are implicated in being called unfair. If you are applying a digital services tax against US companies, for example, Meta would be a great example of that, then you fall under the bill where you could be caught in this trap of being then duly taxed on your end. So, for example, there is a withholding tax rate currently that Canadians pay on dividends that they've received from US companies. So, you get a dividend, and right now, as part of the US-Canada tax treaty, you're withheld at 15%. So 15% is withheld to the IRS. You get the remaining 85% of your dividend in your non-registered account, and then you claim a foreign tax credit back at the end of the year, so you can offset your Canadian taxation with the 15% that you pay to the IRS. Under the new bill, however, they are saying that we're not paying our fair share, and therefore more withholding tax could potentially be withheld against those US source dividends, for example. And this could implicate individuals, pension plans, ETFs, mutual funds, you name it, very, very broadly. And the implication could be that an additional 20%, up to 20% over 4 years of withholding tax could be applied against US source dividends. That currently we don't have a foreign tax credit to offset, which means that we're going to have double taxation on those US source dividends. And what that means is that you could see capital leave the US and leave US companies because people are no longer as interested or have an appetite for that type of double taxation risk, especially if they're receiving a large amount of their passive income from US source dividends. So it is a definite risk on the US's part to implement this bill as is if there is really no consideration the other way for how are they going to reconcile this from the US-Canada tax treaty side. So that's a really big one. And that can also implicate Canadians who have IRAs. So there's been a lot of Canadians.
I had read about that. Tell me more.
Yeah, similarly, in the same vein, Canadians who have worked in the US and who have accrued income in IRAs and have come back to Canada, for instance, have a withholding tax rate, again, usually 15% under the US-Canada tax treaty that's applied against future IRA distributions. Under this new big, beautiful act, that same digital services tax unfair country bias would apply per se against IRA withdrawals as well, meaning that instead of having a 15% withholding on an IRA distribution, it could be up to 35% withholding. And we can't recoup that currently under the existing foreign tax credit system. And those dollars could be much more magnanimous than the dividends that we're getting off of US sourced companies. When you're taking an IRA distribution, if it's forming a large part of your retirement income, that can be tens of thousands of dollars a year. And
That's quite a big difference.
Yeah. And if, it's a 35% withholding tax rate and we're only recouping 15% of that, and then we're being taxed the same in both countries, then we're being unfairly taxed on 20% of that. So that can create a lot of challenges for people that have built up a lot of wealth inside IRA accounts and who are no longer, paying tax to the US because they're not US citizens. And, that's very concerning.
If I was in that situation, especially as a Canadian, it can feel very targeted, very singled out. Again, not as a country or an industry with tariffs, but just as an individual, all of a sudden, your retirement that you built up, and in this situation, theoretically, that you've produced as part of that economy that you've added to, now you're going to be penalized and having a lot of things taken away. Is that the general sentiment and concern from people that you've spoken with?
I think that people understand that's broader than them, but it doesn't take away the frustration. And I think this really, if you look more holistically, is why planning is so important as opposed to a plan. Because planning evolves, right? I mean, legislation evolves, rules change, and we have to realize that there is a certain amount of adaptability that we have to take into account, especially as a as somebody who has cross-border considerations.
Right.
Even if you're just, a U.S. resident or a Canadian resident, you still have to be aware that there could be changes that could, make your planning over time look different. But especially as someone who's navigating cross-border wealth, you almost have double the risk. If not, you compile risk on top of risk, and you have many permutations and combinations of that. So, I think it's important for people to understand that, again, planning is a noun and not a verb. And we have to be aware that, yes, it's frustrating, but this is why we believe in an approach that that persists over your lifetime rather than a static plan, which is really just looking at a snapshot at one point in time.
Yeah, I think when I am speaking with clients, one thing I've mentioned to them before is, if it was 1981 and you had all these assets, my job might not even be necessary, because you could just buy treasuries at 10% and there's your retirement plan. And I think later on, with the 60-40 portfolio and some ideas around that, we crave simplicity. And especially if you listen to a particular author, or someone posting on a blog or has a radio show or whatever it is, we can give general advice, but there's greater complexity. The more complex tax bills, the more complex investments become. Interest rates have been a totally different animal since the 90s. And the more complex this gets, I feel like the greater the necessity for our industry and for our profession. So I completely agree with you. One thing also that we talked about last time is the desire to invest. Obviously, the US economy has a lot of really big, large cap investments that people are choosing, but values-based investing is also growing. Are you seeing that effect on clients that are wanting to invest more back into Canada and less investments into US companies, especially if they're going to be facing this type of taxation?
I haven't seen it yet. I think it's still early days, to be honest.
Sure.
And the US has been just on fire. The S&P has been on fire for many years. And so I think for a lot of individuals, it's hard to pivot away from that as a core strategy, especially given the size of the GDP of the US compared to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
In context, Canada represents 2 to 3% of the world's GDP. So as a percentage of how your portfolio composition looks like, you're usually seeing in Canada a much larger percentage of assets allocated towards Canadian companies, simply because we're home country bias, much more familiar with what we have here. Yeah. And we do have a lot of value companies here as well. Very familiar names. We have a lot more concentrated industry in Canada as well, because we're a smaller nation and we don't have as many, large mega cap companies that we can point to, or even we don't have as much competition in general. So I think that if we're looking at, value-based investing versus growth-based investing, the way that I view the US has traditionally been more so for growth-based investing. Your companies are reinvesting dividends, they're doing share buybacks. They're investing for growth. If you look at the yield of the S&P 500, it's about 1%. The top 10 is even less than that. So we're really looking at the US for more of that growth element. If we're looking for income, we're really not looking to the US for income. So again, going back to that 60-40 portfolio that you mentioned before, we definitely want US exposure. Sure. It's just, where do we have it in a manner that, let's say the big beautiful tax bill does come into effect, that's going to protect us as much as possible from the implications of that. I think it would be foolish to completely shy away from the US. There's still many wonderful companies that will probably survive the storm, let's just say, whatever comes their way. Right. But I think what we're talking about now, more so with clients, is making sure their portfolio is properly diversified. Do we have an international exposure to the portfolio outside of North America? I've definitely spoken with clients who have like 100% US equities, or S&P and NASDAQ only. And it's like, we need to, spread the wings a little bit, because yes, it's performed really well. But as you get closer to retirement age, we really need to diversify the risks, especially considering that we don't know where they're coming from right now. And we need to spread the risk out as much as possible. So
totally agree with that. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And especially coming off the heels of COVID and others, a lot of things that we presume to be bulletproof are not always necessarily.
Yep.
So I think it's great what you're doing as well, because it's a very unique and specific situation, but it's really common. And trying to navigate that yourself can be extremely difficult.
Mhm.
And you aren't always aware of what solutions or new ideas could be out there. And that's really your job, is to stay abreast of those. So I think it's fantastic. Turning away from more of the economic stuff and tax stuff, I'd love to ask you, you've been in the industry and you've got a great deal of experience. Looking at the future, there's a lot of discussion in our industry of what does that look like, as well as pretty much every other industry with AI on the rise. What do you think the future of financial planning looks like?
I think I'm on the right side of it.
Okay.
Um,
Tell me more.
I mean, maybe I'm biased. I think that there is less of an appetite for traditional investment management
Mhm.
with demographic changes. A lot of clients that hire us are clients that are either DIY investing or they're using robo advisors and they're younger. So I do see a demographic shift away
Mhm.
from the traditional model of I'm going to hire an investment advisor and pay them an AUM based fee.
Yep.
Do I think it's going to go away? No, not necessarily, and not in a hurry. But do I think that there is room there for more competition? Yes, absolutely. Um, I'm talking. I have a lot of wealthy clients. I have a lot of clients who are building wealth, and most of them say the same thing: is they're not seeing the value proposition that they would like to see out of the traditional financial advisory profession,
Mhm.
and they don't think it's fair. And this is just them, not me, but they don't think it's fair to pay someone an ongoing 1%, 1.5%, whatever the fee is, when they don't feel like they have seen the value in prior relationships from that investment management fee.
Mhm.
And that's probably because in a lot of circumstances they're looking for more planning and they might not be getting that. I think from what I've seen in my career is that when clients think, again, this is the confusion between financial advisor and financial planner. They
Yes.
think when they're hiring a financial advisor to manage their money, they're getting all of that with it. But that's not always the case. So we really need to educate the public about the differentiation between the two. Going back to your original question, because I know I'm getting off topic again.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
I think the demographic shift and the desire for less lower fees is definitely one element of it, but obviously the AI shift is another element. There are so many tools coming out that I'm seeing, self-directed softwares, ChatGPT, obviously, doing a lot of work for people, but there is a lot left. There's a lot of nuance and context that is missing
Right.
from that at this juncture. We all can rely and sort of utilize those tools in a way that can assist us. But do I think it replaces what we do? Absolutely not. I have worked with ChatGPT just more so from a planning context to see
Yep.
what can it not do? Like, what
Yes.
is it missing, right? It misses stuff, trust me.
Sure.
Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I have run scenarios through ChatGPT. I'm intellectually curious as to what people are doing out there.
Yeah.
It does not capture everything. It doesn't always get taxation, tax credits, doesn't apply concepts fully together yet. We're not there yet. Do I think we will never get there? No. But I do think that there is a lot missing in the interpretation. I also think that the behavioral finance side of the profession is one that you cannot discount.
Right.
Coaching is super important. Guidance, someone to talk to you, someone to build that rapport with and build that trust with. Who knows? Maybe AI bots in the future will be our new best friends.
Yeah.
But
They're
I think,
just so good at being good friends.
yeah,
I've seen a lot of crazy research about that too.
it's true. I mean, my husband has said he's had some of the best conversations of his life with ChatGPT, in which I just laugh.
Right.
But I think we're
Like,
not
thank
there
you.
yet.
All right.
Yeah, right. Oh, yeah. I didn't even consider that he was comparing that to me. Um, he's probably tired of me talking about finance.
Right.
But I don't think we're there yet. Do I
Right.
think that over time we have to be aware of how it can enhance our profession and how people are using it and where they could possibly go wrong with using it? Yes, I think we can really add context and color there. Do I think people still need guidance and mentoring. Absolutely. How do we ensure that the information that people are getting is accurate and right? I
Yeah.
think where we're at today, you cannot rely on that material and you cannot rely on that guidance fully. You really need to ensure that you have the experience to interpret the results and say, is that even close to correct or
Yes.
not? Because you can't see anything behind the scenes, right? Like you don't know where this information is getting pulled from.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree with that. I think when we think about where we have been from the creation of really good search engines on the internet and seeing how that changed to something that was, I don't want to say manipulated, but is adjusted based on which search engine you use.
mhm.
People have preferences for that now. I'm going to use this search engine versus this search engine because I have greater faith or trust in what type of information they're tracking from me, but also what type of information that they're going to put from me, and search engine optimization and everything that happens there. So I also agree. I think it's just a matter of time where these tools, which are fantastic, I think there's a lot of great use for them,
Mhm.
they're also going to still become competitive. You know, Chat
Yeah.
GPT is the most popular and it's the biggest go-to right now. But what happens as we have started seeing things like DeepSeek or others,
Mhm.
especially for businesses, I'm with you. I really think that there's still going to be a need for our profession. My big hope is that it almost has a YouTube effect, which is that you enable independent creators, and in our case,
Mhm.
independent planners, by removing a lot of barriers to entry, making things simpler, and
Mhm.
therefore much more specialized.
Yeah.
YouTube is extremely competitive with a wide array of things. It's not gate kept the same way that, you know, getting on one particular news channel versus another news channel was back in the day.
Yeah.
But it also means there's a lot more specialization, and I think that could be really powerful for people that are coming up in this next generation of planners that are just getting started now.
Yeah, I think it's important because there are a lot of influencers out there who don't have any accreditation to their name, and that is a scary place that I see a lot of individuals going to get their
Mhm.
financial information.
Yep.
There's a lot of blind leading the blind out there on Reddit. I see that too.
Yep.
It's not a bad thing to seek community and to find other people in like situations, but if that's not their specialization or acumen, you really have to just make sure that you're not taking things and applying it to yourself because everyone's financial situation is different. I've even had clients who have used some individual tools that are out there, like
Yep.
great calculators that are available online, more fulsome financial planning engines that are becoming available. But where they kind of get stuck is in the interpretation of the results. They
Right.
don't
Yeah.
really know what to do with this information, right? Okay, I put all the information in the software and it spits out this result, but I'm not really sure how to take that. So again, it's all about context. It's about how do you apply the knowledge of what that information means? And I think that's where we can really have a positive impact.
I agree with that. I think there's also a bit of nuance, as you described,
Yeah.
because you're putting your experience to bear for a client coming to you with a specific expat need, or maybe it's a cross border situation and
Mhm.
they're coming to you. They've got one scenario, their life that they have to solve for, but the benefit of working with you is that you've done that for hundreds of people
Mhm.
and that you're ongoing with them.
Yeah.
And by being able to see where things could have gone awry or where things could have gone better and anticipating where life happens and decisions change, I'm with you. I'm a big believer in behavioral finance.
Yeah.
We have to be aware of that mobility and where that's going next.
Yeah. One other thing I'll speak to on behavioral finance too is there's I'm sure you're aware of behavioral therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of financial planning doesn't even get it past the start line because there are a lot of innate experiences or
Yes.
traumas that people can have had as a child or growing up or even in early adulthood that could make them paralyzed and not be able to do anything and not even to be able to move themselves off that starting line. A bot or a tool can't help you with that. You really need to be able to get yourself to a point therapeutically where you can start to have these conversations, or even to start looking at yourself. Because I do think financial planning is like looking into a mirror and saying, okay, I might not like, like what I see right now,
Yep.
but it's okay. I can accept me for me, and I'll take everything in and I can adapt. And that's a hard thing to do for anybody. And it's a very vulnerable position to be in as well. I know a lot of cases where it's been really difficult for clients in COVID, where they feel like maybe their income has been severely affected, for example, and they're used to being a breadwinner, and they're
Oh,
used to, providing for the family, and all of a sudden, their world has totally shifted.
yes.
Um, you know, and that can lead to a lot of feelings of inadequacy, of not wanting to face the music, of just trying to get through the days because we're human. So
Yeah.
there's this major human element of experience and feelings that are really important to address, that I think is something that we have to pay attention to as planners. And I am not licensed, as a behavioral therapist, for example.
Right.
Like I know enough to identify possibly where my limitations are,
Sure.
but often, clients have to be willing to consider that if they want to get off the starting line, that's something else they might want to look into. And again, going back to, how is AI able to help and change all of this? I do know that in certain circumstances, people are using AI for therapy
Sure.
because it's not a human and it removes bias. So
And
maybe there's,
and sometimes the vulnerability. It's a little
yeah,
easier to talk to a
totally.
non-human entity. Yeah.
Totally. And do they have, I mean, is an AI bot a therapist? No, they're not a therapist. But if it's helpful to be able to open up in a way that you feel like there's no judgment and no bias, maybe that's a good place to use AI to
Yeah.
start that journey, right? And if it helps you along the way with having the conversations that are hard to have with yourself, but in a way you're having them with yourself, I think that's a really good use of that type of technology, then maybe get you to the point where you can address some of your financial questions and situation.
I think it's excellent. Andrea, again, thank you for your time today.
You're
If
welcome.
anyone wants to be able to work with you, where would they go? Would that be directed to your website?
So I run a multi-planner advice-only planning practice, Modern Sense at CENTS.ca. We work with Canadian residents only at this time. So any U.S. tax filers living in Canada, or Canadians who have accrued U.S. wealth in the past, or just basic domestic Canadians, which still have a lot of complexity. We're happy to help.
Excellent. I'll put your website in the description. Again, can't thank you enough. I appreciate your
Thank you.
time and look forward to seeing more of what you do in the future.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much, Michael.